Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Tim Baker is my name. I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the characteristics of high-performing teams. And I think in my book, Winning Teams, the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams, I identify 8 of these characteristics. And one of those characteristics is improving systems. And I think many of us are spending so much time working in the business, we forget to work on the business. And ultimately, of course, when we don't work on the business, nothing improves. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about learning and how important it is and how we can really improve the learning capacity of our team, but to do it without taking much time. So this is the problem, of course, because by the time we're down tools, we just don't have the time to do that because we're on to the next big thing. So I'm sure it would be of benefit to you if we could find a system where we could actually continuously learn, but at the same time not reduce a huge amount of time away from the work. So what I'll do is I'll share my slides and we'll get stuck into the presentation. Okay, So just a little bit about me. For those of you who don't know me, I am an author. I've got 15 books, or I will have 15 books out very soon. One of those books is Winning Teams, the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. And in that book, I'm going to share with you one of the characteristics, as I said, of high-performing teams. You can see that I present keynote addresses. I also run workshops. I'm an executive coach, and you can also see I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition in Brisbane. So I have a fairly busy life, and let's get stuck into the presentation. A number of people wrote some very nice testimonials about my book, Winning Teams. You can see there's a number of players in the Australian Wallabies team. Grant Fox from the All Blacks also wrote a really nice testimonial about my book, and the Commissioner of Police in Queensland. So it's been getting wide traction, which is wonderful for me. And Nick Farr-Jones writes a nice testimonial about the book. So there's a lot of things that we can learn in the world of sport that apply to the world of business. And I think what I've tried to do in the book is be able to combine those two, some interesting and entertaining anecdotes about high-performing teams in the world of sport and what some of those lessons are for the world of business. So I'm going to share with you some of that today. Now, one of the key objectives, of course, with this whole notion of working on the business rather than in the business is how do I debrief a project so that it stays focused and the findings are embedded. Because often when we do a project, we all understand the value of doing a debrief. But the question then is, how is it possible for those learnings to be implemented and for those learnings to stick, basically? This is a big concern for a lot of team leaders, and I want to share with you a way of doing that today, so that rather than just go through the process of a debrief and just hope that the message hits the mark with our team members, we actually want them to take on board some of the key learnings and apply them in a way that's effective. So I'm going to talk about 4 debriefing options that you've got open to you when a project's completed. I'm going to talk about the after-action review, which is something that some of you would be familiar with. Although I must say that the after-action review gets a bad rap sometimes. It's come originally from the military, and the corporate world has adopted it, and I think that's a good thing. But unfortunately, what's happened is people are using it as a box-ticking exercise. And as a result of that, it's lost its whole effectiveness. So I want to talk about how you can rejuvenate the after-action review. And I'll talk about some of the actual uses of that as well. And of course, at the end of the presentation, I've got a special offer for you regarding my book, Winning Teams, the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. Okay, so if you look at this model here, which comes from my book, you'll notice on the outside, there are 8 characteristics of high-performing teams: building trust, sharing leadership, being agile, creating purpose, managing stakeholders, improving systems, utilizing diversity, and learning continuously. Now, I'm going to focus today only on improving systems, and there'll be subsequent opportunities during my Friday session where you can tune in and learn about the other characteristics around the model. So let's talk about improving systems, because I don't know of any high-performing team, whether it's in the world of sport or business, that doesn't want to continuously improve its processes, its systems, its procedures, the way things are done. So, and as I said earlier, the reason why people neglect these things, unless of course something goes completely wrong and then we've got to stop everything just to fix the problem, I think the reason for that is that people know that it does take some time, or they think it takes some time. And I want to show you some ways where you can do that very, very easily. So there are a lot of high-performing teams in the world of sport, and in business there are high-performing teams as well, although I would have to say that then there's not as many as perhaps we would like. But I'm hoping that I can help you with this book to make a transition from a mediocre team to a high-performing team, and to maintain that high performance. That's the key. You can arrive at being high-performing by having all of those attributes I mentioned, but you can backslide very easily as well. It only takes one incident, it only takes one poor interaction with a customer or a stakeholder, and you can find that your team goes back to where it was originally. So I'm going to talk about some of the anecdotes in the All Blacks as well as what we're doing here. Okay, so let's launch into the 4 different options that you've got open. So when you're debriefing a project, you've basically got 4 options. So on the left-hand side, you can see that we're talking about formative options. Now, formative options are options of debriefing throughout the project. So there might be different times when you might debrief at different points during a project. Now, summative, as in summary, means this is about debriefing at the end of a project. So this is usually a larger debrief where we might have several stakeholders in the room. We have our team members there, and we talk about what went well and what didn't go well in the project. So there's 2 distinctions. And then over on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's informal review options and there are formal review options. Now, informal means impromptu. Basically, it's done perhaps in a corridor, or it's done on the spur of the moment, whereas formal is a set debrief. So this is an opportunity that's already been scheduled, that we're going to sit down with the team and we're going to go through the project. So within those parameters, you've got 4 different options. You've got regular dialogue, and regular dialogue means that during the project, we communicate with each other informally to keep up to speed with what's happening, finding out what needs to be improved, what things are working, what things aren't working. So you have the regular dialogue on an ongoing basis, and you have the, just going clockwise here, you have the end of job debrief, which might be an informal debrief for a smallish project where you might get your team together in an impromptu sense and pretty much ask people how things are traveling, what's working in the project, so this is done, of course, at the end of the project. Now, the end of a project report is a little bit more formal. That is where you might have a series of presentations, you might have a written report, but basically it's a far more formalized approach. It's usually in the calendar. This is things that people need to attend at the end of a project. The check-in is a sort of an is formal, but it's usually a sort of a meeting that's held at maybe weekly or fortnightly throughout a project, where the stakeholders get together and they talk about the progress report as to how it's going. We often call these a work in progress. And then the final one is the regular dialogue. And as I said before, it's really about the sort of informal catch-ups that we have. So you've got 4 options there. Now, within those 4 options, there's one thing that they do all have in common, apart from the fact that they are a debriefing opportunity, and that is that you can use the same approach or technique, which is what I refer to as the after-action review. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you might use that in your own sort of approach. So Peter Senge, who wrote a book that was very famous, The Dance of Change, had this to say about the Army's after-action review, and I think it's high praise. I'll just read that through. The Army's after-action review is arguably one of the most successful organisational learning methods ever devised. Yet most every corporate effort to graft this truly innovative practice into its culture has failed because again and again, people reduce the living practice of the after-action review to a sterile technique. So we've used this as part of our quality assurance. It's a box-ticking exercise, unfortunately, in a lot of cases. So Senge certainly gives it high praise, but he is arguing that it's not being used as effectively as it can. And what I'm hoping to do here is give you a couple of tips on how you can improve the after-action review in these 4 different debriefing possibilities that you have in a project-based environment. So I think personally, the 3 questions that you can ask during a project to focus very much on improving systems are these. And I think you should do these in this order, and I'll explain why in a moment. And I also think that it's really important to do this when you've got a number of people involved in the project. You can certainly do this one-on-one, and I imagine in an impromptu environment, it would probably be possible that you could do an after-action review in the corridor. But I think the idea is to try to get your team members involved in this, and there's a good reason for that, because one reason is that you want to tap into the resources of your team, and the reality is you don't have all of the knowledge and all of the wisdom. Your team members probably do have some fantastic ideas, and if they're not involved in the debrief, then it's left up to you, and I don't think that's wise. The second and more important reason why you want to get your whole team involved is that you want them to be engaged in the learning. So you actually want them to take away from those after-action reviews the key insights and apply them in their own way. And there's an old saying that people don't argue with their own data. In other words, if you get everyone involved and you ask them these 3 questions, it's likely that you'll get some feedback, and that feedback that you get from other people will be very much adhered to, because it's coming from the people in your team. It's not coming from you, in other words. So the very first question you would ask is, what systems, processes, and procedures are working well? Now, obviously, if this is during, in a formative sense, if this is done during a project, obviously you can change or tinker with those systems and processes if necessary. And at the end, in the summative debriefs, it might be about looking back and reviewing. But nevertheless, we always start with the positive, and there's a good reason for that, because no matter how bad a project is done, there's always some positive things that have occurred in a project. And what we want to try and do is capture what is actually working. So that's why we start with the positive. And sometimes people are a little reluctant to talk about these things, so you might have to push a little bit about that. But, so what has actually worked, or what is working extremely well if it's done during the project? So once you've exhausted that question and you've got a number of things, the point about whatever people raise, and if there's some genuine agreement about that, then the idea is just to continue to do that, because obviously it's working. But the second question is different emphasis completely, and that is, what systems, processes, and procedures are not working well? And again, no matter how good the project is, if it's an extremely successful project, there is always something that can be improved. And what we're trying to capture here is the things that aren't working as well as they should. And what I'm looking for there from the team is guidance on those things that perhaps need to be improved. Now, once we've identified those things, we're in a position, of course, to respond to the third important question. So the third important question is where the rubber meets the road, and that is, what improvements or changes can we make for the future? So what we're trying to do here is capitalize on the first two questions and find some things that we need to do differently from this exercise. And, you know, it's, you don't need a huge amount. In fact, it's probably not a good idea to have 25 different improvements at this point, because it's almost impossible to implement that amount. But certainly if you've got one or two really strong suggestions in a debrief, then it's very easy relatively to be able to apply those to improve for the future. So these three questions are very powerful, and they don't take very long, and it's probably likely that you're going to do a debrief anyway. So instead of just sort of asking people how things are going, which is often, I find, what leaders will do, that it's more targeted to ask these three questions, which is the backbone of the after action review. But after action might sound a little bit misleading, because as I said earlier, you can do this during a project. It doesn't need to be done at the end. So if I try those three questions, they are extremely powerful and effective. Now, there are a lot of uses for this. You can use this, you know, when you've actually implemented a new system. And, you know, so it might be something that's quite foreign to people, and you've implemented it and you want to get some feedback on that. So it would be a good idea then to get your team together after a trial period and ask people what's working, what's not working, and what are some of the suggestions for improvement. It could be very good after a busy period when capacity is stretched. So you've got a busy period and people might unfortunately be cutting corners, and you've got people who are very much working under pressure. And as soon as you have an opportunity and there's some light at the end of the tunnel, you might sit down with your team and do an after action review. And I think that would be a good way to consolidate a very busy period. Also, if you're using a trial period for a new system, so let's say you've got a pilot that you're implementing and you want to see how it's working, then it would be obviously a good opportunity at the end of that trial to get the team together and ask them what's working, what's not working, and what they would do differently as a result of that. If your team's embarking on a training exercise and it's quite involved, perhaps it's a one-day workshop or maybe longer, then it would be very wise of you to sit down with the team at the end of that and ask them, well, what was good about what we did? What were some of the things that perhaps weren't applicable? And what could we apply in our own working environment as a result of that? So that can be a very effective use of the AAR as well. And I think between shifts, for those of you who work in shift environments, shift working, in between shifts, so you've got one shift that's finishing and another shift that's starting, you've got that sort of period of a transition between the two shifts. This is the perfect opportunity to ask those three questions, because that gives the new shift some insight into what's happening from the previous shift and what can be applied in the new shift. So there's some opportunities. That's not an endless list. That's not a defined list. There is endless possibilities for using this. All right, so here's a couple of examples in real life. I'm doing some work in a police jurisdiction, and one of the inspectors in the homicide area told me that she doesn't sit down, but after they've gone to a murder investigation, perhaps in someone's house, she gets her team out on the pavement. It might be 1 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning, And basically she does a debrief before people go home. And so it's a stand-up meeting, and she'll actually ask people what went well, what didn't go well, and what will we do differently. Now, that's a very effective technique. It takes, according to her, about 10 minutes at the most. And everybody, because everything's fresh in their mind, and of course they're keen to get home after a busy day or week, she's able to glean the knowledge from her team that way. Now, I asked her and I said, well, why don't you leave this to a Monday morning? And she told me the reason for that is simply this, that by the time it's Monday, a lot of the lessons are lost. So by doing it this way, she can certainly hone in while it's fresh in people's mind and probably get more done that way. So that's one example. Another example is I'm working in an IT startup firm, and in the IT startup firm, there are very, very few systems, processes, and procedures because it's new. And after a major project, working with a client, some sort of an implementation, the leader will spend a bit of time at the end of each project asking people what went well, what didn't go well, and what will we do differently next time. And this gives the team an opportunity to have an input into creating the right structures for an IT startup firm. And that works extremely well. So that's something you might like to think about. Now, another example, which is a far more formal example, and this would be a summative example of debriefing, is that one council that I was doing some work in was doing some major capital works in the region. And after the capital works had been completed, and this project took about 8 months, but after this was all done, then there was a meeting that was held where all the stakeholders, members of the community, council, some of the contractors and the like, were asked to come to a meeting at council, and they were asked to debrief on the project. And again, it focused very much on the 3 questions that I've gone through: what went well, what didn't go well, and what will we do differently. Now, out of that came a whole lot of really powerful learning, and council was able to implement, some of that learning from the information from these particular stakeholders involved in the project. So there's 3 examples, and I can only say to you that it's a really valuable exercise if it's done well. And I think that if you're really looking at improving your systems in your team, and you should be, this is the most efficient and effective way that I know that you can do that. And I find that teams that do this can often get tremendous results because they're focusing very much on people's learning. And as I said earlier, because you've got the various stakeholders in the room, whether it's your team members or others, they're more likely to take it on board because they've had a really good opportunity to have their say in the debriefing process. Okay, so folks, next Friday, and for those of you who are not aware, I have one of these sessions every Friday. I've had to unfortunately change the time today to 9 o'clock, but next week it will revert back to 10 a.m. and it's normally at 10 a.m. that we have these sessions, and I designed them to make them very short and very relevant to your needs. So next week, I'm going to look at building a robust team identity for optimal performance. And team identity is very important, and it's often a misunderstood concept. So I want to talk about that, and how can you craft a really effective team identity that can aid your team to optimize its own performance. And again, this comes from my book, Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams. So please join me next Friday, and you can see at the bottom there's a link. I'll be sending you out a copy of the slides and a recording at the end of this presentation. And at the end of this presentation, when you get that, you just have to click on the link and do exactly what you did today to reserve your spot. So we look forward to seeing you next week on that very interesting topic. Finally, as I mentioned before, I did say to you, I had a special offer, and my book Winning Teams is actually now on Amazon, and it's priced at $28 plus postage. But if you send me an email by the close of business today, I'd be happy to send you a copy of the book for $15, virtually half price and postage. I'll also sign the book for you. So there's an opportunity for you, because you've taken time out of your busy schedule to be here today with me to talk about my book. So please take advantage of that. I look forward to responding to your emails at the end of this presentation. All right, so folks, thanks for the opportunity of working with you. I hope you found that useful. The after action review is a very powerful strategy. It's something that's very effective, but unfortunately it's not well understood, and it's not well used in the corporate world. And I think that, I think if we can use this the way I suggested, you will find that you can actually use continuous improvement on a regular basis, project by project. And of course, as I said earlier, it doesn't have to be done at the end of the project. You can actually complete this during a project and take the learnings from that and apply them before the project's finished. So there's an opportunity for you. So folks, thank you for your time. I wish you a nice, safe weekend, and I look forward to catching up with you next Friday at 10 a.m. for my next session. Thanks everyone, all the best. See you later. Bye.